There's one question paleontologists have been asking for more than a century that still doesn't have a completely satisfactory answer. Why so big? Not in the vague sense of why sauropods were large, but in the precise, almost philosophical sense of why some of them were so immensely, disproportionately, seemingly absurdly large. Why did a Patagonia need 70 metric tons to live its life when a 15-ton diplodocus did essentially the same thing in the same type of ecosystem? Why size continued to increase in certain lineages for tens of millions of years beyond any point at which adaptive advantage might continue to explain the increase? Why evolution, in the case of Megasauropods, seems to have gone further than any reasonable selective pressure could justify. To answer that question, or at least to honestly approach it, we need to start from the beginning. Not from the beginning of sauropods, but from the beginning of the problem, from the fundamental mechanics of why being large is, in general, a good idea for a herbivore, and at what point that good idea becomes a trap from which there is no evolutionary exit. Biologists have been studying the consequences of body size on animals for decades, and the result of these studies is a series of mathematical relationships between size and almost every conceivable biological variable. Metabolic rate, speed of reproduction, gestation or incubation time, lifespan, area of territory needed, thermoregulation efficiency, vulnerability to predation, ability to access food resources. The set of these relationships is known as allometry, and its conclusions are both elegant and disturbing. The most relevant conclusion for our history is this: metabolism scales subliminally with body mass. When the size of an animal is doubled, its metabolism does not double, but increases by about a factor of 1.75. This means that as animals get larger, the metabolic cost per kilogram of tissue decreases. A 5-ton elephant needs proportionally much less food per kilogram of its weight than a mouse. A 50-ton sauropod needs proportionally much less food per kilogram than an elephant. This economy of scale in metabolism is the fundamental reason why, in environments with abundant plant resources, gigantism tends to be a successful strategy. You can process more gross biomass with lower relative metabolic investment. The second relevant consequence of size is protection against predation. A 50-ton animal in good health has no natural predators. No known carnivore, past or present, can kill a healthy adult of those dimensions. Extreme gigantism is the biological version of invulnerability. When you grow old enough, you stop needing active defenses, you stop needing escape velocity, you stop needing constant alert behavior. You can simply devote all your energy to eating and reproducing. In evolutionary terms, that is precisely the definition of success. But there is a threshold, a point beyond which gigantism begins to generate its own problems, and Megasauropods lived on that threshold, and some of them crossed it. This is his story. The family tree of the giants. Sauropods did not appear out of nowhere in the Jurassic, with their 70 tons and 30 meters in length. They were the result of an evolutionary process that began in the late Triassic, with animals of modest dimensions, and accelerated during the Jurassic to produce the largest known forms in the history of terrestrial life. To understand Megasauropods, we need to understand where they came from and what pushed them in the direction of the colossal. Sauropods belong to the broader group of saurischιans, that is, lizard-hip dinosaurs along with theropods. This relationship, which at first glance seems strange given that theropods include large bipedal predators while sauropods are gigantic herbivorous quadrupeds, is well established by phylogeny and reflects a fundamental difference between the two large groups of dinosaurs. Saurischιans shared with their ancestors the hip structure in which the pubis pointed forward, while ornithischians, the group that includes ceratopsids, stegosaurids and hadrosaurids, had their hips rotated differently. This anatomical distinction, which may seem like a minor technical detail, has profound implications for understanding the evolutionary history of dinosaurs. The ancestors of sauropods in the Triassic were significantly different animals from their Jurassic descendants. Prosauropods, which lived between 230 and 180 million years ago, were dinosaurs between 2 and 10 meters in length that combined bipedia with quadrupedia, depending on the circumstances. They had relatively long necks for their size, but jaws with denticulated teeth capable of rudimentary chewing, and diets that are probably omnivorous or unspecialized herbivores. The 8-meter, 1-ton Plateosaurus engelharti of Europe is one of the best-known prosauropods, abundant in European late Triassic ecosystems, socially and relatively successful for millions of years. True sauropods appear in the fossil record in the early Jurassic, approximately 180 million years ago. The first genera, such as the Vulcanodon caribensis from Zimbabwe and the Tazoodosaurus naimi from Morocco, were already animals several meters long and several tons in weight, but modest compared to what would come later. The important thing about these early sauropods was not their size, but their body plan. They had already established the fundamental architecture that would allow later extreme gigantism. Spine in horizontal bridge, long neck with pneumatized vertebrae, limbs in the spine that supported the weight in pure compression. The scaffolding was ready. It just took time and the right ecological pressures for it to scale. The early and middle Jurassic saw the initial diversification of sauropods into several evolutionary lines that would follow different paths to gigantism. The Cetiosaurids, Theuriosaurians, Macronarians and diplodocids represent some of the main branches of this family tree, each with its own solutions to the problems of how to be a large herbivore in a world with abundant vegetation but resistant to digestion. By the late Jurassic, some members of these lines had already reached sizes that are unprecedented in the history of terrestrial vertebrates, and in the Cretaceous, with the Titanosaurs, the process would reach its most extreme culmination. But before we talk about the individual giants, we need to talk about the innovations that made gigantism possible, because Megasauropods weren't just large dinosaurs, they were dinosaurs that had solved, in ways that no other group of vertebrates has matched, the engineering problems that extreme gigantism poses. Engineering for enormity. Imagine you're an engineer who is asked to design a 50-ton animal capable of walking on 4 legs, feeding exclusively on vegetation, keeping its vital tissues oxygenated and at a constant temperature, and reproducing successfully enough to maintain a viable population. The problem has solutions, but each of them generates new problems that in turn require new solutions. The evolution of Megasauropods is the story of how natural selection solved each of those problems in a process that lasted more than 100 million years and produced some of the most biologically sophisticated organisms this planet has ever known. The first problem is structural. How do you hold 50 tons on 4 limbs without the skeleton collapsing? The sauropod solution was bone pneumatization, taken to extremes that have no equivalent in any other group of vertebrates. The vertebrae of sauropods were not solid masses of mineral tissue. They were excavated by air cavities interconnected with the respiratory system, the air sacs that, as in modern birds, acted as bellows for the continuous flow of air through the lungs. In the most derived sauropods, such as Supersaurus vivus and several Cretaceous titanosaurs, solid bone tissue could account for less than 10% of a vertebra's total volume. The rest was air, organized in chambers separated by bone sheets in an architecture that modern engineers would recognize as a topological optimization of the distribution of the material, maximum structural rigidity with minimum mass. This pneumatization was not just an adaptation to reduce weight. It was also a direct consequence of the continuous flowing respiratory system that sauropods, like all dinosaurs, inherited from their archosaur ancestors. The air sacs that made continuous flow breathing possible expanded throughout the body, penetrating the bones and leaving cavities that fossilization preserves with surprising fidelity. Each vertebra of a sauropod is a 3-dimensional X-ray of its respiratory system, and paleontologists can reconstruct the architecture of that system in remarkable detail from the pneumatization patterns they observe in fossils. The second problem is the locomotive. How do you move 50 tons efficiently? The limbs of sauropods were true columns of bone, with the femur practically vertical and practically straight, without the curvature that we see in large mammals, and the feet relatively small for the weight they supported. The biomechanical analysis of sauropod locomotion has been the subject of multiple studies over the past 2 decades, combining finite element models, analysis of footprint traces, and comparisons with current large animals such as elephants and rhinoceroses. The results are consistent on one fundamental point: sauropods could not trot or gallop. Its maximum speed of sustained locomotion was a march, that is, a step where at all times at least 3 limbs were in contact with the ground. The estimated speed from footprint traces is between 6 and 12 kilometers per hour for large adults, comparable to the comfortable walking speed of a human being. This may seem slow, but it makes sense. For a 50-ton animal, the run would generate impact forces on the limbs that no bone structure could withstand indefinitely. Modern elephants, which reach 7 tons at most, have developed the same solution. They never simultaneously lift more than one limb off the ground when moving fast, producing an accelerated gait that is not technically a race. The third problem is food. How do you consume enough vegetation to support 50 tons of living tissue? The sauropod's solution was as elegant as it was counterintuitive: don't chew. Large herbivorous mammals such as elephants, rhinos, and hippos invest enormous amounts of time and energy in chewing their food before swallowing it. Elephants spend between 16 and 18 hours a day feeding, and their molars are progressively worn structures that are replaced 6 times throughout their lives. The sauropods did without all this. Their teeth, simple pegs or shovels depending on the genus, without crushing ridges or complex occlusion, were only used to uproot or comb the vegetation from their substrates. The food was swallowed directly, without prior chewing, to be processed in the bulky digestive tract by a combination of gastroliths, that is, deliberately ingested stones that acted like a bird's gizzard, and prolonged bacterial fermentation. This strategy allowed for extraordinarily high intake rates. With no chewing time, the sauropod could uproot and swallow vegetation almost continuously. Intake models for a 40-ton Brachiosaurus estimate food needs of between 250 and 400 kilograms of vegetation per day, about the equivalent of a large bale of straw every 24 hours. A 5-ton elephant consumes between 150 and 200 kilograms per day, which in terms of intake per ton of body mass places Brachiosaurus in a position of greater relative efficiency. Metabolism allometry did its job. The fourth problem is that of the neck. The necks of sauropods are, due to their length, the most extreme structures produced by vertebrate evolution. No other animal with a backbone has developed a neck that represents such a high fraction of the total body length. The neck of Supersaurus vivus, estimated to be 15 meters in length on a body of 33 meters in total, represents almost 45% of the animal's length. That of Mamenchisaurus sinocanadarum, which could have reached 16 meters in neck out of an estimated total of 35 meters, exceeds it. How can a structure of these dimensions be sustained and moved without prohibitive energy consumption? The answer combined pneumatization with a ligament and tendon architecture that allowed passive support of the neck in certain positions without continuous muscle contraction. The resting position of the sauropod neck has been the subject of intense debate, with positions ranging from horizontal neck to near vertical neck, depending on the genus and method of analysis. What is clear is that each genus had a resting position and an active range of motion, and that this architecture determined how much of the plant environment could explode without moving the body. The diplodocids, the elegance of length. The first major lineage of megasauropods that deserves detailed study is that of the diplodocids, a group that reached its maximum diversity and greatest size in the late Jurassic of North America and Africa, and which represents perhaps the most elegant solution to the problem of being a giant herbivore in a world with abundant but irregularly distributed vegetation. The Diplodocus carnegii, whose skeleton was acquired by the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie at the beginning of the 20th century, and whose plaster casts populate natural history museums around the world, had a length of 26 meters and an estimated weight of between 12 and 15 tons. By megasauropod standards, it was not exceptionally large in terms of mass, but its proportions were remarkable: a neck of about 8 meters and a tail of between 15 and 16 meters that represented more than 60% of its total length. The tail of the Diplodocus was not simply a passive appendage. It was an active counterweight to the neck, a balance lever that allowed the animal to shift the center of mass as needed, and possibly an active weapon capable of producing a sonic impact when shaken at maximum speed. The cranial morphology of Diplodocus is revealing of its feeding strategy. The head was disproportionately small for the body, with an elongated square muzzle and peg-shaped teeth arranged only at the front of the jaws like a rake. This type of teething was perfectly suited for combing branches and pulling vegetation massively and quickly, but absolutely unsuitable for chewing. Diplodocus must have fed like a vacuum cleaner of vegetation, passing its snout between the fronds of ferns and the low branches of conifers, tearing off all accessible material in a single movement and swallowing it directly. Supersaurus vivus and Seismosaurus halorum took the diplodocid body plan to its extremes. The Supersaurus, known from fossils found in Colorado and Wyoming since 1972, could have reached between 30 and 33 meters in total length, with an estimated neck of 15 meters. Their weight, however, was probably between 30 and 40 tons, an extraordinarily low number for such an extreme length, confirming that the diplodocid strategy of using length rather than mass as a competitive advantage was taken to its fullest expression. The Supersaurus was possibly the longest animal that has ever existed on land, although not the heaviest. Apatosaurus ajax and Apatosaurus louisii, which were for decades confused with Brontosaurus, represented the opposite end of the diplodocid spectrum. Instead of maximizing length, they maximized mass. An adult Apatosaurus could weigh between 30 and 35 tons with a length of 21 to 22 meters, which produced a much more compact and robust animal than the Diplodocus or the Supersaurus. The neck of Apatosaurus was noticeably wider and more muscular than that of its relatives, with larger diameter cervical vertebrae and more developed lateral processes suggesting considerably more powerful cervical musculature. Some researchers have proposed that Apatosaurus used its neck more actively as a battering ram or as leverage to knock down tougher vegetation than the more graceful-necked diplodocids. Brachiosaurus altithorax and Giraffatitan branchi represent the point of maximum gigantism within the brachiosaurid lineage, which is technically separate from diplodocids, but shares the late Jurassic period as the time of maximum expression. The Giraffatitan branchi, known for the impressive skeleton mounted in the Natural History Museum in Berlin, which is the tallest dinosaur skeleton in the world, with more than 13 meters in total height, had radically different proportions from those of the Diplodocus. Long neck but oriented almost vertically at rest, forelimbs longer than the hind limbs producing a humped profile, and a skull with large nostrils raised above the snout that for decades generated speculation about whether it might have had a proboscis. Their estimated mass is between 40 and 60 tons, with the usual uncertainty associated with mass estimates in animals of this size. The Morrison Formation, the Jurassic Laboratory. To understand late Jurassic Megasauropods in their actual ecological context, we need to spend some time in the ecosystem that has best preserved them. The Morrison Formation, that sequence of sediments deposited between 156 and 147 million years ago in what are now the western states of North America. Morrison is our most detailed window into the world that Megasauropods inhabited, and what that window reveals is both more complex and more dynamic than any simplified image of dinosaurs grazing in green landscapes can suggest. Morrison's climate was seasonally arid. It was not the humid rainforest that is sometimes imagined for the Jurassic, but an environment with prolonged dry seasons interrupted by periods of heavy rainfall, similar in general terms to the present-day African savanna, but with a completely different flora, no grasses, no deciduous trees in the modern sense, no flowering plants. Rivers were seasonal in many regions, reducing to a fraction of their maximum flow during the dry months. Paleosols, that is, the fossil soils that Morrison preserves at multiple levels, show signs of cycles of moisture and drought that must have profoundly affected the availability of vegetation for large herbivores. In this seasonally stressful environment, at least 4 or 5 genera of large sauropods coexisted: Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, Camarasaurus, Apatosaurus, and Brontosaurus, with additional presences of rarer genera such as Haplocanthosaurus and several smaller taxa. This coexistence of multiple giant herbivores in the same ecosystem has intrigued paleontologists for decades. How could an ecosystem with pronounced dry seasons support such an extraordinary herbivore biomass? The most compelling answer involves separating food niches. Carbon isotope analyses on the teeth of the different genera, reflecting the isotopic properties of the plants consumed, which in turn differ depending on the type of plant and the height at which it grows, suggest that each genus exploited a different portion of the available plant environment. Brachiosaurus, with its raised neck and longer forelimbs, reached the tops of conifers at heights of 10 to 15 meters. The diplodocus, with its long but more horizontal neck, combed vegetation of average height between 2 and 6 meters, and possibly also the creeping vegetation on the ground. Camarasaurus, with a more robust skull and stronger jaws, could process tougher vegetation with thick woody branches and hardy cycad fronds that the other genera avoided. This vertical and qualitative separation of the food niche reduced direct competition and allowed for the coexistence of a diversity of giants that would otherwise have been ecologically unsustainable. The traces of Morrison's footprints add another dimension to the painting. Ichnological sites, that is, the sites where traces of footprints of multiple individuals are preserved, show sauropods moving in organized groups, with the youngest and smallest individuals within the group. Footprints from a Texas site show at least 23 sauropod individuals moving in the same direction with regular separations from each other, in what is the most direct evidence of gregarious behavior in animals of these dimensions. But the tracks also show something more disturbing. At some sites, the footprints of large theropods, probably Allosaurus, appear parallel to those of sauropods, following them at a constant distance. The hunt, or at least the evaluation of hunting opportunities, was literally recorded in stone. Because even Jurassic Megasauropods were not completely invulnerable. Healthy adults of 30 or 40 tons were effectively out of reach of any predator, the largest known Allosaurus reaching 2 tons, a 20-to-1 ratio that made any successful frontal attack impossible. But the young, the sick, the wounded, and the old were another story. The fossil record documents Allosaurus bite marks on sauropod bones, including vertebrae, ribs, and limb bones, and the biomechanics of Allosaurus, with its extraordinarily muscular neck designed for top-down impacts, was perfectly suited for tearing apart a carcass or attacking vulnerable individuals. Morrison's Megasauropods lived in a world with predators. Their size protected them remarkably, but not absolutely. Asia and its secrets, the Mamenchisaurids. While diplodocids and brachiosaurids dominated the late Jurassic ecosystems of North America and Africa, another sauropod lineage evolved independently into extreme gigantism at the other end of the world. The Mamenchisaurids of Asia, whose most distinctive feature makes them perhaps the most extraordinary evolutionary experiment within an already extraordinary group. The Mamenchisaurids took their name from Mamenchisaurus constructus, discovered in China's Sichuan province in 1952 during road construction, when workers found the bones on the slope of a geological cut, and paleontologist Yang Zhongjian described them the following year. In the following decades, multiple species of the genus Mamenchisaurus were described from sites in China, Mongolia, and Thailand, with sizes ranging from 15 to more than 35 meters in total length. The defining feature of Mamenchisaurids is the extreme length of the neck in proportion to the body. While diplodocids had necks that accounted for 30 to 45% of their total body length, Mamenchisaurids took this ratio to levels that have no equivalent. Mamenchisaurus sinocanidorum, described in 1993 from fragmentary material from the late Jurassic of China, had an estimated neck of between 15 and 16 meters over a total body of 35 meters, about 46% of the total length. The Xinjiang titan Shanshanesis, described in 2013, could have reached 32 meters in length with a neck of 15 meters, almost 47%. The number of cervical vertebrae in Mamenchisaurids reflects this extreme length. While most mammals have exactly 7 cervical vertebrae, Mamenchisaurids had between 19 and 24, the largest known number in any tetrapod. Each individual cervical vertebra could reach 90 centimeters in length in the largest genera, and each of them was deeply pneumatized, with bone sheets that were arranged in patterns that engineers of lightweight structures would recognize as analogous to lattice beams, maximum flexural rigidity with minimum mass. What did the Mamenchisaurids do with those extraordinary necks? The question has sparked debate because such a long neck poses physiological challenges that are not immediately apparent. The most striking is cardiovascular. To pump blood from the heart to the brain through a 15-meter neck, the heart of a Mamenchisaurid needed to generate extraordinarily high blood pressures when the neck was elevated. Estimates based on hydrostatic models suggest systolic pressures of between 400 and 700 millimeters of mercury. compared with a normal 120 millimeters of mercury in a human, to maintain an adequate blood supply to the brain of a Mamenchisaurid with a vertical neck. This implies a heart of extraordinary dimensions, as estimates for the largest sauropods suggest hearts between 200 and 400 liters in volume, and perhaps valve systems in the cervical arteries to prevent blood from flowing back to the heart under the force of gravity. Modern giraffes, which have the same problem on a much smaller scale, have solved this problem with a disproportionately large heart weighing more than 11 kilograms in an adult and with a network of specialized blood vessels at the base of the brain called the rete mirabile that cushions pressure changes when the head moves between high and low positions. Sauropods likely had analogous systems, although the fossil record does not preserve cardiovascular soft tissues often enough to confirm this directly. The resting position of the neck largely determines the answer to the question of what this extreme length was for. If the neck was mainly kept horizontal, as some biomechanical analyses suggest based on the shape of the joint facets between vertebrae, then its function was mainly to extend the horizontal foraging radius. A standing Mamenchisaurid could access the vegetation of a huge surface without moving its body. If the neck could be raised to significant angles, then access to the vegetation at height in the treetops of the Asian Jurassic, which included conifers and ginkgos of considerable height, was the main advantage. Current evidence suggests that reality was a combination of both functions, with different genders optimized for different strategies within the same overall body plan. The Cretaceous and the Titanosaurs, the final climb. If the Jurassic was the first great era of Megasauropods, the Cretaceous was its culmination, and the culmination had a name: Titanosaurs. The clade Titanosauria, which includes all sauropods more closely related to Saltosaurus loricatus than to Brachiosaurus altitherax, was the group of sauropods that survived until the end of the Cretaceous and which, in its most extreme representatives, reached the largest absolute sizes known in the history of land animals. Titanosaurs were not simply diplodocids or scaled brachiosaurids. They were a lineage with their own anatomical solutions to the problem of gigantism, some of which differed significantly from those of their Jurassic relatives. The most notable difference was skeletal. The vertebrae of titanosaurs had procoelian joints, that is, with a concave anterior and a convex posterior face, like a ball in its cup, which differed from the flat or slightly concave convex joints of the diplodocids. This joint morphology gave the titanosaur spine greater lateral flexibility, which would have allowed them greater maneuverability despite their extreme size. The titanosaur lineage also showed in some of its branches the appearance of osteoderms, dermal bony plates embedded in the skin, which are not known in other sauropods. Saltosaurus loricatus, discovered in Argentina in 1980 and named after the province of Salta where it was found, was the first sauropod in which these osteoderms were documented, causing a considerable revision of ideas about the body surface of sauropods in general. Saltosaurus's osteoderms ranged from oval plates several centimeters in diameter to smaller nodules scattered across the skin, forming a flexible armor that would not have impeded movement but would have added protection against the teeth of abelisaurids, the characteristic predators of Gondwana in the Cretaceous. But osteoderms and procoelian joints are secondary details. The main characteristic of titanosaurs, in the context of this documentary, is their size. And when we talk about the size of the largest titanosaurs, we are talking about numbers that require a moment of pause to be fully appreciated. The Patagotitan maiorum, scientifically described in 2017 from an extraordinarily complete specimen found in the province of Chubut, Argentina, is today the largest known land animal with the best fossil backing. Estimates of their mass, based on the circumference of limb bones, the most reliable method available for estimating the weight of extinct animals, range from 69 to 77 metric tons. His femur measured 2 meters and 40 centimeters in length and had a circumference that required 2 people to hug him. Its total length is estimated at between 36 and 37 meters. It is the largest animal to have walked on the surface of this planet, with the level of certainty that the fossil record allows, but the Patagotitan was not alone. Argentinosaurus huinculensis, known for much rarer fragments such as some dorsal vertebrae, fragments of ribs and a fibula, but whose dimensions are equally extraordinary, has generated mass estimates ranging from 70 to 100 tons depending on the method used, and the assumptions about the animal's proportions. The uncertainty is so great that some paleontologists consider it useless to try to estimate their mass with the available materials. What is clear is that it was an animal of dimensions at least comparable to the Patagonia and possibly larger. Dreadnoughtus shrani, discovered in Argentine Patagonia and described in 2014, adds another dimension to the picture of Cretaceous megasauropods. With an estimated length of between 26 and 30 meters and an estimated mass of between 36 and 7 tons, the Dreadnoughtus is remarkable not only for its size but for the fact that the type specimen, as the individual from which the species was described is called, shows signs that it had not yet reached its adult size when it died. The limb bones do not show the fusion of the epiphyses or the ends of the long bones, which indicates skeletal maturity in dinosaurs. An adult Dreadnoughtus would have been significantly larger than the known specimen. The problem of reproduction. There is a paradox at the heart of megasauropod biology that no study has fully resolved. How could a 60 or 70-ton animal reproduce in a way that made its population viable? The problem is not trivial, and its implications extend from reproductive biology to population ecology and the genetics of gigantism's evolution. All known dinosaurs reproduced through eggs. Sauropod eggs, known from numerous sites in Argentina, France, India, Romania, and Mongolia, were surprisingly small for the size of adults, typically spherical or oval, with diameters of between 15 and 30 centimeters for larger species. A Patagotitan egg could have had a diameter of no more than 25 centimeters. The calf that hatched from it weighed perhaps between 5 and 10 kilograms. The adult weighed 70 tons. The calf needed to increase its mass by a factor of 7,000 to 10,000 to reach adult size. This size discrepancy between newborns and adults is unparalleled in any living animal. The African elephant, the largest land animal today, is born with between 100 and 120 kilograms and reaches 5,000 kilograms at maturity, a factor of 40 to 50. Megasauropods had to overcome this factor by an order of magnitude. The implication is that postnatal growth must have been extraordinarily rapid during the first decades of life, and that young animals must have radically different food needs and ecological behaviors than adults. Osteohistology analyses, that is the study of growth rings in bones which are deposited in a manner analogous to tree rings, have made it possible to estimate the growth rates of several sauropods with remarkable accuracy. Apatosaurus louisai, one of the best-studied Jurassic sauropods in terms of growth, reached about 90% of its adult mass within 15 years, with mass increase rates of up to 5 tons per year during the period of most rapid growth, between 5 and 15 years of age. For Cretaceous titanosaurs, data is scarcer, but available analyses suggest similar or even higher rates with individuals who could have reached reproductive maturity at 20 or 25 years. The relative smallness of eggs has a physical explanation. The maximum size of an egg is limited by the need for gas exchange through the shell. The embryo needs to receive oxygen and expel carbon dioxide, and both processes occur by diffusion through the pores of the shell. The larger the egg, the greater the volume of embryonic tissue that must be oxygenated, but the surface of the shell does not grow at the same rate as the volume. There is a maximum size above which the embryo cannot receive enough oxygen even with a pored shell, and that size is about that of the largest known sauropod eggs. An egg of 30 centimeters in diameter was already at the limit of what was physiologically viable. Sites of titanosaur nests in Argentina show that these animals nested in dense colonies, with nests separated by distances of just a meter or two. The proximity of the nests suggests that the adults did not physically incubate the eggs, but buried them in the ground or covered them with decaying vegetation so that biological or geothermal heat would incubate them passively in the style of today's reptiles and some megapod birds. What happened to the young once they hatched is one of the great unknowns in the biology of megasauropods. In Aucamahuevo, embryos have been found with preserved skin that shows a texture of small polygonal scales without feathers or visible filamentous structures and with teeth already formed and functional. The young were probably precocial, that is, able to feed independently from day one, like the chicks of many birds, rather than altricial, that is, dependent on parental care to survive, like humans. The simple fact that adults could not incubate the eggs or approach the nests without crushing them suggests that physical contact between adults and newly hatched young was minimal or non-existent. Patagonia, the epicenter of the giants. If there is one region of the world that has transformed our understanding of megasauropods in the last 4 decades, that region is Argentine Patagonia, not for a single reason, but because of a convergence of geological, paleontological, and scientific factors that has made this region the place where the limits of dinosaurian gigantism continue to be rewritten almost every year. Patagonian geology is exceptional for the preservation of fossils from the late Cretaceous. The sedimentary formations of the provinces of Neuquén, Rio Negro, Chubut, and Santa Cruz include layers of clays, sandstones, and siltstones deposited in fluvial and lacustrine environments during the Upper Cretaceous that have been exposed to the surface by differential erosion of the last tens of millions of years. The arid climate of modern Patagonia, with little vegetation covering the rocky substrate, makes it easy to expose fossils to wind and water erosion, and the region's low human population density means that many sites remain in optimal preservation conditions until they are discovered by paleontologists. Argentinosaurus huinculensis was described in 1993 from material found in the Huincul Formation of Neuquén by paleontologist Rodolfo Correa and the owner of the ranch where the fossils were found, José Bonaparte. For years it was considered the largest dinosaur known, with mass estimates exceeding 80 tons in some reconstructions. The source material is fragmentary, and size estimates have varied considerably depending on the methods and assumptions used. What no one disputes is that it was an animal of monumental proportions. The most complete dorsal vertebra is 1 meter 52 centimeters tall, taller than an average adult human being. The Notocolossus González Parellasi, described in 2016 from material from the Plotio Formation of Mendoza, provided a surprising anatomical fact. The metacarpus of the Notocolossus showed a morphology that the researchers described as the most derived known in any sauropod, with robust and cylindrical metacarpal bones that formed an almost vertical column, an extreme adaptation to support the massive weight of the forelimbs in animals of these dimensions. The foot of the Notocolossus, equally well preserved, was almost circular in plan and had dimensions comparable to those of the wheel of a medium-sized tractor. Phytologchosaurus duquei, described in 2007 from exceptionally complete material from the Portezuelo Formation of Neuquén, provided the most complete skeleton of a sauropod over 30 meters known to date. Approximately 70% of the skeleton was preserved, including most of the vertebrae of the spine, the scapular and pelvic girdles, and fragments of the limbs. With an estimated length of between 32 and 34 meters and an estimated mass of between 30 and 40 tons, Phytologchosaurus was not the largest Patagonian titanosaur, but it was by far the best known, and the anatomical details provided by its relatively complete skeleton have been essential for reconstructions of other genera known from more fragmentary material. The story of Patagotitan majorum deserves a detailed account, because it is also the story of how modern paleontology works in the 21st century. In 2011, an employee of the La Flecha ranch in the province of Chubut, named Aurelio Hernandez, noticed a huge bone protruding from an eroded slope. He called the paleontologists of the Egidio Ferruglio Museum of Trelew, who began excavations the following year. What they found in the next 4 years of work in the field was a set of fossils of at least 6 individuals of the same Titanosaur species, with the total completeness of the most represented specimen of about 70%. The work of preparing the fossils in the laboratory lasted several additional years before the team led by José Luis Carbalido and Diego Pol was able to publish the formal description of the species in 2017. It took 6 years for Patagotitan to go from the field to the scientific journal. Africa and Europe, the forgotten giants. The popular narrative of megasauropods tends to concentrate on North America and Argentine Patagonia, but sauropod gigantism was not an exclusively American phenomenon. Africa and Europe, whose paleontological records of sauropods are less publicized but no less extraordinary, contribute essential dimensions to the understanding of the global phenomenon of gigantism in these animals. The Tendaguru Formation of Tanzania, excavated in 3 major expeditions, one German between 1909 and 1913 and 2 more recent ones, has produced some of the most important sauropods in the history of paleontology. Giraffatitan branchi, which we have already mentioned in relation to the late Jurassic, is the best known, but the Tendaguru was also home to Gigantism robusta and Tendaguria tanzaniensis, relatively primitive titanosaurs that document the presence of this lineage in Africa as early as the late Jurassic, earlier than previously known. The similarity between the fauna of the Tendaguru and that of the North American Morrison Formation was for decades one of the main arguments for the hypothesis of a late terrestrial connection between North America and Africa, although the most widely accepted explanation today involves dispersal across archipelagos. In the Cretaceous, North Africa produced a sauropod fauna that complements and in some respects exceeds the Patagonian in terms of diversity and potential size. Paralititan stromeri, described in 2001 from material found in Egypt's Baharia Formation, had a humorous 1 meter 69 centimeters in length, implying an estimated mass of between 50 and 70 tons. Paralititan lived in a mid-Cretaceous coastal mangrove environment, a habitat completely different from the continental environments of Patagonia, suggesting that Megasauropods were capable of exploiting a much greater variety of ecosystems than is sometimes assumed. Ruquatitan bisepultus and Shingopana songwensis, both described from material from the late Cretaceous of Tanzania in recent years, document the presence of sizable titanosaurs in East Africa during the same period when the Patagonian giants reached their maximum dimensions. These African species are important because they help chart the patterns of global dispersal of titanosaurs. When African and South American faunas separated as the Atlantic Ocean expanded, which lineages crossed between continents at what time, and how gigantism evolved independently on different continents. Europe, in the late Cretaceous, was an archipelago. Epicontinental seas flooded much of what is now the European continent, leaving islands and peninsulas where dinosaurs evolved in conditions of insular isolation. The consequences of insular isolation for large herbivores are well known in modern evolutionary biology. Insular dwarfism, the reduction in size that occurs when a population is isolated on an island with limited resources and no large predators. Late Cretaceous European sauropods show exactly this phenomenon. Magyarosaurus dacus from Romania, Ampelosaurus atarsis from southern France, Lyranosaurus astibiae from northern Spain were all titanosaurs significantly smaller than their continental relatives, with estimated masses of between 3 and 10 tons, a fraction of the size of Patagonian giants. They are miniature megasauropods, a reverse evolutionary experiment that illustrates with perfect clarity that gigantism was not an inevitable trend, but a response to specific conditions that could be reversed when those conditions changed. The limits of gigantism, when evolution found its ceiling. The question we've been circumventing since the first chapter now deserves a straightforward answer. Was there a limit to the size of sauropods? Was there a biological or physical ceiling beyond which no sauropod could have survived? And if such a roof existed, were the larger megasauropods close to it, or was there still room to go further? Available biomechanical models suggest that the roof existed and that some Cretaceous megasauropods might have been close to it. The strongest argument comes from limb mechanics. As an animal's mass increases with the cube of its linear dimensions while the cross-section of its bones only increases with the square, there is a size at which the limb bones cannot support the weight of the body without fracturing. Elephants have partially reached this limit. Their limb bones have a bone mass to cross-section ratio that is close to the tolerable maximum without a fatigue fracture during normal locomotion. 70-ton sauropods were clearly beyond the point where that ratio was comfortable for a mammal, but their respiratory system of pneumatized bones reduced the mass of the skeleton so significantly that the breaking point shifted to larger masses. The most rigorous calculations, published by researchers such as Paul Upchurch, Matt Weddell, and Mark Hallett, suggest that the theoretical mass limit for a sauropod is somewhere between 80 and 120 tons. The largest animals known with relatively reliable estimates were therefore close to the ceiling, but probably not at it. There was biological space for somewhat larger animals, although each additional ton would have created engineering problems that were increasingly more difficult to solve. The most likely limiting factor at the higher end of sauropod size was not bone strength but reproductive energetics. As the mass increases, the time to reproductive maturity lengthens, so it would take 20 to 30 years for a 70-ton titanosaur to be reproductively mature. The interval between consecutive litters is lengthening. The number of eggs per clutch cannot increase indefinitely because each additional individual requires space and resources during the incubation period. The result is an intrinsic reproductive rate that decreases with size, and at some point that rate becomes so low that the population cannot recover from disturbances such as droughts, epidemics, or mass predation events on the young. Larger animals have inherently more vulnerable populations, and there is a size beyond which the vulnerability of the population outweighs the individual advantage of size. There are also ecosystem arguments. The largest megasauropods needed enormous amounts of vegetation to sustain themselves, and herds of these animals could radically transform the landscape in short periods. Ecological models of Patagonian Cretaceous ecosystems suggest that the population densities of giant titanosaurs had to be very low, perhaps 1 to 2 individuals per 100 square kilometers, for the plant ecosystem to recover from its herbivory. At these population densities, the minimum viable population size, that is, the number of individuals below which consanguinity and demographic stochasticity make extinction inevitable, becomes a threshold that is difficult to overcome. The largest megasauropods lived in population terms on a razor's edge. There is something almost tragic about this conclusion. The largest animals that have ever existed on the Earth's surface were also, by their very gigantism, the most vulnerable to local extinction. Their enormous individual size made them virtually invulnerable to predation as adults, but their enormous population size made them dependent on vast territories, stable and productive ecosystems, and reproduction rates that any disturbance could destabilize. They were invulnerable as individuals and fragile as species. And the history of the last 66 million years of the Earth is, in part, the story of what happens to animals that carry that kind of vulnerability built into their biology. Scale predators. Who hunted the giants? No history of megasauropods would be complete without talking about the animals that shared their ecosystems in the role of predators, not because predators could regularly hunt healthy adults, but because the relationship between giant sauropods and their predators is one of the most revealing chapters in Mesozoic paleoecology. In the late Jurassic Morrison Formation, the main predator was Allosaurus fragilis, with its 2 tons and 12 meters in length in the largest known individuals. The size disproportion between Allosaurus and a 30-ton adult Apatosaurus was 15 to 1. No Allosaurus, acting alone, could kill a healthy adult Apatosaurus. But the ichnological records, which show large theropods following groups of sauropods and the Morrison sauropod bone bite marks, paint a picture of calculated opportunism. Allosaurus waited for the young, the sick, the wounded, the isolated individuals of the group. Direct hunting of healthy adults was unlikely. Carcass consumption was almost certain for animals of that size, where a single 30-ton carcass represented months of feed. The South American Cretaceous had its own cast of predators on a monumental scale. Giganotosaurus carolinii, with its 12 to 13 meters in length and its estimated 8 to 10 tons of mass, was a contemporary of Argentinosaurus and probably its main predatory interaction. The size disproportion was still enormous, but Giganotosaurus was a predator of an effectiveness and sophistication that Jurassic North American theropods did not have. Analysis of its skull shows jaws with laterally compressed blade-like teeth, perfectly designed to produce deep cuts in soft tissue rather than crushing bone like the late Cretaceous T-Rex. Their likely strategy was to inflict severe cut wounds and wait for blood loss and infection to complete the job. Carcharodontosaurus saharicus from North Africa, a contemporary of Paralittodon, had dimensions similar to Giganotosaurus and comparable cranial morphology. It is notable that the 2 largest theropods known in history, Giganotosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus, were contemporaries respectively of 2 of the largest megasauropods of the Cretaceous. The coevolution between the size of predators and the size of available prey is evident even at this extreme scale. It makes no evolutionary sense to be a 10-ton carnivore in an ecosystem without 100-ton prey, because the cost of maintaining that size cannot be covered by small prey. The Tyrannosaurus rex of the North American late Cretaceous, with its 6 to 9 tons and 12 to 13 meters, did not coexist with the larger Megasauropods, since by the time T-Rex evolved, the sauropods of North America had significantly decreased in size and diversity compared to those of the Jurassic. Their main prey were hadrosaurs and ceratopsids of between 3 and 10 tons, that is, large animals but well below the scale of a Patagotitan. However, T-Rex is relevant to our story because it illustrates a trend that repeats itself multiple times in Mesozoic history. As giant sauropods become rarer or disappear from an ecosystem, top predators evolve into strategies designed to exploit the prey that remains, not the ones that are no longer there. The end of the giants. Megasauropods didn't disappear all at once. Its final story is more complex and more nuanced than the simple image of a mass extinction that wipes out the largest animals in history. And understanding that final story tells us important things about the fragility of evolutionary extremes and about what happens to lineages that have pushed an adaptive tendency to its limits. During the late Cretaceous, sauropods experienced a relative decline in Laurasia, the northern landmass. In North America, late Jurassic sauropods had been replaced by hadrosaurs and ceratopsids as the dominant herbivores of continental ecosystems. The sauropods that survived in North America during the late Cretaceous, such as Alamosaurus sanjuanensis, a large titanosaur that recolonized North America from South America across the beginning to form isthmus, were giants, yes, but less diverse and probably less abundant than their Jurassic predecessors. In Gondwana, the Titanosaurs maintained their dominance until the end of the Cretaceous. Sauropods survived in the southern hemisphere to the same stratigraphic level that marks extinction 66 million years ago, with the same degree of apparent normality as hadrosaurs in the north. There were no signs of imminent gradual decline in Patagonia's late Cretaceous ecosystems. Megasauropods were there, in their ecosystem, feeding and reproducing until the world changed so rapidly and so radically that no adaptive strategy could compensate for it. The Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, 66 million years ago, was devastating for all non-avian dinosaurs, but it was especially devastating for larger animals. The reasons are multiple and mutually reinforcing. The impact winter-collapsed photosynthesis on a global scale for months or years. Without photosynthesis, the base of the food chain disappears. Without vegetation, herbivores die, and the animals that needed the most vegetation to survive were the first to die. A Patagotitan needed 400 kilograms of vegetation a day to maintain its metabolism. In a world where photosynthesis had been reduced to a minimum, that supply simply ceased to exist. Large sauropods could not hibernate as their body mass was too large to accumulate sufficient fat reserves for months without feeding. They could not migrate to regions where photosynthesis continued because the impact was global and left no climatic refuges for large herbivores. They could not change their diet towards resources that did not depend on active photosynthesis because their digestive morphology was completely specialized for living or dead vegetation of recent plant origin. The animals that survived the extinction had something that megasauropods did not: flexibility. They were small, with low energy needs that could be met with scarce and varied resources. They were omnivores or capable of a food opportunism that the giant herbivores could not imitate. They could go into torpor or hibernation when resources were scarce. They could reproduce rapidly, with short generations allowing natural selection to act in an accelerated manner in response to new conditions. Megasauropods had taken specialization to the extreme, and the extreme, when the world changes radically, is the most dangerous place a species can be found. When evolution went too far, we have finally arrived at the question that justifies the title of this documentary. Was the evolution of Megasauropods an example of evolution going too far? Was there a point when the gigantism of these animals became an evolutionary trap from which there was no way out? And if that happened, what does it tell us about how evolution works at extremes? The honest answer is that evolution cannot go too far in any absolute sense. Evolution has no direction, no intention, no concept of too much. Natural selection favors traits that, in a given environment, increase the survival and reproduction of the individuals who possess them. In the late Jurassic and Cretaceous ecosystems, gigantism in sauropods was adaptive. It increased individual survival, reduced vulnerability to predation, improved metabolic efficiency per unit mass, and expanded access to food resources. Selection favored the increase in size generation after generation, and the size increased. But the environment in which a species evolves is not static, and when the environment changes quickly enough, traits that were adaptive can become deadly debts. The gigantism of Megasauropods was perfectly suited to the Cretaceous world. It was a reasonable and successful response to the selective pressures of that world. What he couldn't do was prepare those animals for a radically different world that arrived in the space of months. In this sense, the story of Megasauropods is not a story of evolutionary excess, but a story of radical contingency, of how evolutionary solutions to the problems of the present can become insurmountable obstacles when the present is abruptly transformed into a completely different future. It's the same story that repeats itself in every mass extinction in Earth's history. The specialists, the great, the highly adapted die first. The generalists, the small, the flexible survive. And from the survivors, in the ensuing geological time, emerges a new fauna of specialists, new great, new highly adapted, until the next catastrophe does the job again. Megasauropods also tell us something about the limits of paleontological knowledge. The largest animal to ever walk the Earth may not have been found yet. Cretaceous geological formations that preserve terrestrial fauna are abundant in South America, but also in Africa, Central Asia, and regions of Eastern Europe that have been relatively little explored for historical, political, and economic reasons. Every year, the Patagonian sites produce new genera and new specimens that shift the estimates of the maximum size upwards. Patagotitan's record could be broken by a fossil that is being eroded right now by the Patagonian wind, waiting for someone to find it. The methods for studying these animals are continually improving. Synchrotron tomography allows the internal architecture of sauropod bones to be reconstructed with a resolution that would have been impossible 10 years ago, revealing details of the tracheal system and bone tissue distribution that inform mass estimates more accurately than any external measurement. Stable isotope analyses in teeth and bones make it possible to reconstruct diets, geographic ranges, and growth rates with an accuracy that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. Computational models of fluid dynamics make it possible to simulate the hemodynamics of a 15-meter neck with a quantitative rigor that purely anatomical studies cannot achieve. And yet, there are aspects of megasauropod biology that will likely remain inaccessible forever. We won't know for sure what sounds, if any, they produced. We will not know if they had a complex social life or if they were animals of relatively simple behavior. We won't know if females and males differed visually in ways that were important to their reproductive behavior. We won't know what the world smelled like from a Titanosaur's perspective, or what it saw with its wide-field side eyes as it moved through a Cretaceous angiosperm forest. What we do know is that these animals existed, that for more than 100 million years they walked on the surface of this planet, ate, reproduced, raised their children, survived droughts and diseases and predators, and left the indelible trace of their passage in the rock. That the ecosystem in which they lived was so rich and so productive that it could sustain dozens of animals of 50 or 70 tons per 100 square kilometers. That planet Earth was, during that time, a place that would be unrecognizable today, warmer, greener, more full of life in its most extreme forms. When we excavate a 2-meter 40 femur from the Patagonian soil, when we need a crane to remove it from the site, when we measure it and calculate that it was the support of 70 tons of life, we are not just learning about an extinct animal. We are measuring the distance between the world that was and the world that is. We are taking the temperature of a planet that was able to produce the greatest life that has ever existed, and that today, under different pressures and largely caused by us, is in the process of losing even the most modest life. The Megasauropods left us their bones, they left their footprints on the stone, they left us with the question of whether life on this planet can ever again produce something as extraordinary as a 70-ton animal that walks, eats, breathes, cares for its young in a world of endless vegetation. The answer, given the rhythms of evolution and the scale of geologic time, is probably yes. That if we give it enough time and enough stability, life on Earth tends towards the extreme, towards the improbable, towards what at first glance seems impossible. But time and stability are precisely what we are consuming faster than any other resource. And megasauropods are the planet's most telling reminder of what happens to life when the world changes too fast for any adaptation to keep up. that 2-meter-40 femur in the soil of Patagonia, that vertebra higher than a man, that trail of footprints in the stone where the mud of 150 million years ago registered the weight of the largest animal that has ever walked this earth. They are messages from a world that was, addressed to a world that is, about a world that could cease to be. Paleontology, in the end, is not only the study of the past, it is the only science that can show us, with the evidence of the bones, where each of the directions that life can take leads.